On to priority area 1 for illustrative indicators and actions. Priority area 1, as you remember, is facilitate the adaptation of people and firms. So action 1.1 here was to assess disaster and climate risks and assess disaster and climate risks and make information available to all. Information is a big part of the poverty. Poverty is not always about just economic status. It's also about access to information, which could include early warning systems and being trained to interpret and act on those early warning systems. So information is very critical to reduce poverty as well. Number of weather or hydrological observation stations operational in the country, which is not very systematically taken care of by many countries in the developing world, where they may not have a well-organized meteorological service, weather service, but at least the countries who invest in computational and human resources to run climate models or weather models, they have to have a good weather and hydrological observation stations. Even if they don't have early warning systems, they can use these and empirical methods to issue some level of early warnings with proper preparation based on other examples from other countries, or relying on forecasts issued by international centers which are served on the webs, and they can be used for near real-time forecasts, few hours to a day or so. Real-time availability of hydromet observations. Time series of hydromet observations are freely available. Percentage of country covered by high-resolution digital terrain model. This is very complicated. Digital terrain model, DEM, is digital elevation model, also it's known as DEM. Basically, to actually do flood forecasts, especially during heavy rain events which are increasing in many places, to actually convert it into floods at local levels where decisions have to be taken in terms of, let's say, closing the traffic, shutting down the traffic, or trains, or evacuating hospitals, etc., maybe sometimes evacuating people. Then these digital elevation models become critical. Percentage of country covered by high resolution hazard maps for current and future risks with multiple scenarios. This is not easy because you need data to map risks, and as we said before, IPCC defined risk in the assessment report 5 of 2014 as a multiplication of hazard, which comes from climate issues or other hazards, vulnerability, which relies on many indicators, per capita income and the kind of house you live in, and etc. And exposure is where it depends on the infrastructure, the population density of a region, etc. So hazard times vulnerability times exposure. In AR6 they added response to this, so hazard times vulnerability times exposure times response, because response can greatly reduce your risk, especially if it is set up with proper early warning systems. So to do that, you need lots of data at very high granularity in space and time, which is not always available. So these will have to make great progress. Risk assessment for main economic sector done and publicly available, including opportunities where competitive advantage may improve. We looked at that a little bit. So you can also see how many of the risk assessments actually also indicate opportunities. Okay, challenges and opportunities are always often two sides of the same coin. Data platform providing easy access to hazard and climate change scenario data. Exactly how this will be used and interpreted has to be carefully done, because lenders may use it in one way to force people to take loans they don't necessarily need. So, but governments may have to use this to prepare, or firms may have to use this to prepare their logistic chain vulnerabilities and their business contingency or business continuity plans, and so on. Guidance materials and methodologies available to users on how to access and include disaster and climate information in decision making. This is for people and firms. So individual family level decisions for savings for the future, firming up the houses, etc. And firms having a good sense of risk-informed decisions for, maximizing their profit, which is usually their goal. So moving forward to action 1.2, clarify responsibilities and align incentives with adaptation and resilience objectives, as we saw. Law allocating responsibilities and liabilities for disaster risk management and climate change impacts are passed. Target level of residual risks published and publicly available, for example, through residual flood risk maps. Specialized agencies to manage watershed level water sharing established. So these are kind of government level efforts to prepare people and firms for adaptation. Action 1.3, facilitate access to technologies through R&D investments and trade policies. Share of farmers using improved crops and climate smart practices is monitored and is being progressively increased. Share of R&D or percentage of patents related to climate change adaptation. Total amount invested in R&D on adaptation or resilience related challenges. These are indicators to be tracked. Amount invested by the public sector in R&D on adaptation or resilience related challenges. Amount invested by private sector in R&D on adaptation or resilience related challenges. Average tariff applied to imports of resilience related technologies. So you can adjust these tariffs to facilitate people and firms to get prepared for adaptation. Action 1.4, ensure financing is available to all and provide support to the poorest and most vulnerable people. Number of firms and people accessing dedicated financing instruments, for example, guarantees, subsidized loans. So many times such tools are set up, such provisions are made, but poor people may not have the information and may not even know they exist, and when they try it, there may be obstacles that prevent them from accessing them. Total borrowing for adaptation through dedicated windows to be tracked. Most vulnerable populations and communities, occupations, localizations, poverty, ethnicity, and so on are the indicators used for computing vulnerabilities typically. They are identified and information is published, so people and decision makers are aware. Share of poor and vulnerable population receiving support for adaptation has to be tracked. Total subsidy and spending targeting poor and vulnerable populations to support adaptation action. So agency is needed. Willingness and ability to act depends on all these things. Finally, action 1.5, facilitate structural change in the economic system. Strategy to manage the decline of negatively affected sectors is published. Strategy to support the development of non-affected or positively affected sectors is also published. Share of GDP in sectors expected to be negatively affected, so that large-scale fiscal, macro-fiscal issues are tracked and are ready for shocks. Share of GDP in sectors expected to be positively affected, so maybe you can do compromises of moving the budget items around or creating reserve funds for dealing with shocks. Share of employment in sectors expected to be negatively affected, and share of employment in sectors expected to be positively affected. Again, retraining people may be involved here in terms of adaptation. Share of exports in sectors expected to be negatively affected, and share of exports in sectors expected to be positively affected, so that, for example, monsoon was forecasted to be potentially decreased this season because of El Nino, so the Indian government started to control export of sugar and wheat. So these are negatively affected in exports, and there will be others which will be positively affected. Measure of economic diversification, for example, number of exported products or latent diversification. So we'll come back and look at priority area 2 in the next section. I'm putting these in each section, so I'm recording them together here. That's why I keep saying next podcast, but when you read these or listen to these, they will be in each section. Okay.